We tend to think of our gut as just this engine for processing food, right? Like that's its job.
Yeah, pretty much.
But imagine it's more like a thriving city inside you, packed with trillions of tiny residents, bacteria, viruses, fungi, all sorts of microscopic life.
It's an incredible ecosystem.
And scientists are even starting to call it our second brain, which
Hmm.
sounds kind of wild, but it suggests this isn't just a passive digestive system. It's actively talking to our actual brain.
That's a great way to put it. And the real key to understanding this is what we call the microbiome gut-brain axis, or MGBA for short.
MQBA, okay.
Yeah, think of it like this super complex two-way communication highway. Your gut and all those microbes living there are constantly sending messages back and forth with your central nervous system.
So it's not just one-way traffic from the brain down.
Not at all. It's definitely bidirectional. We're talking nerve signals, hormones flying around, immune cells getting involved, metabolic messengers. It's a really intricate conversation.
Okay, so when people talk about having a gut feeling, maybe there's like some biological truth to that. It sounds like this connection has massive implications.
Oh, absolutely, especially when we think about mental well-being.
Right.
There's more and more evidence popping up that suggests conditions like anxiety, depression, maybe even things like ADHD. They could have, well, significant roots or at least contributing factors right there in the gut.
That really changes the game, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Moves us away from thinking mental health is only about the brain.
Exactly. It becomes a much more whole-body perspective. And that's really what we want to dive deep into today. We're going to explore the main ways, the mechanisms by which our gut microbiome seems to influence our mental state.
Okay, so what are we covering?
Well, we'll look at how these tiny organisms can actually produce some pretty important brain chemicals. Then, how they communicate using this major nerve highway, the vagus nerve.
Ah, the vagus nerve. Heard of that.
Yeah. And what happens when the gut lining gets compromised? You might have heard the term leaky gut.
I have, yeah. Sounds unpleasant.
It can lead to inflammation, which is another key piece. We'll also touch on how our very early life experiences shape this whole gut-brain connection. And finally, the links researchers are finding between an imbalanced gut, what we call dysbiosis, and specific mental health conditions.
What's really interesting to me, though, is that you're saying we're not aiming for some kind of universal eat this, not that list by the end of this.
No, definitely not. It's much more nuanced.
It sounds like it's more about understanding how this communication works and acknowledging that everyone's gut environment is unique and adaptable, like learning the language they speak, not just giving dietary orders.
Precisely. It's about the mechanisms. So let's jump into those communication pathways. One of the most, frankly, surprising things is that our gut microbes can actually make molecules that are basically identical to the neurotransmitters our own nervous system uses.
That is wild. You mean like serotonin and dopamine?
Yeah.
We usually think those are made in the brain.
Well, take serotonin, probably the most famous mood regulator, right?
Right. The happy chemical.
Get this. Something like 90 to 95% of your body's total serotonin isn't made in the brain. It's produced right there in your gut.
95%? Seriously?
Mostly by these specialized gut cells called enterochromaffin cells, or EC cells. And our gut microbes, especially certain types like spore-forming bacteria, play a really big role in encouraging those cells to release serotonin.
How they do that?
They produce these byproducts when they digest fiber things called short-chain fatty acids, or SCFAs. Butyrate is a key one. These SCFAs stimulate the EC cells. It's a profound link, really. When we think mood, we have to think gut.
Okay, but hang on. If it's made way down in the gut, how does it affect my mood up in my brain? Isn't there that blood-brain barrier stopping things from just crossing over?
That's a really crucial question. You're right. The serotonin made in the gut mostly acts locally. It affects gut motility, secretions, that kind of thing. It doesn't just flood across the blood-brain barrier.
So how does it signal the brain then?
Indirectly. One major route is via that vagus nerve we mentioned. It can sense the gut environment and send signals upwards. Another way is by influencing the levels of tryptophan, which is the amino acid building block for serotonin.
The precursor.
Exactly. Tryptophan circulates in the blood and can cross the blood-brain barrier to be used for serotonin production in the brain. So gut activity can influence the amount of tryptophan available for the brain. It's an indirect but important influence.
Okay, that makes sense. And I guess if that gut serotonin system gets messed up.
Then you can see links to things like IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, but also potentially mood disorders too. The regulation seems quite important.
Okay, so that's serotonin. What about GABA, That's the one that helps calm us down, the anti-anxiety neurotransmitter.
That's right. GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the central nervous system. Super important for managing anxiety and stress.
And microbes make that too.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Several types of gut bacteria, including some lactobacillus strains, the kind you find in yogurt and fermented foods sometimes, and also bifidobacterium strains, can actually synthesize GABA from glutamate.
So we literally have little GABA factories in our gut.
Essentially, yes. Specific examples like Lactobacillus rhamnosus, Lactobacillus brevis, Bifidobacterium dentium, Bifidobacterium adolescentis, they've all been shown to produce GABA.
But again, the same question. Does that gut-produced GABA get into the brain to calm us down?
That's the million-dollar question, and the research is still ongoing. We know for sure that GABA produced by microbes can influence the enteric nervous system, that's the gut's own nervous system.
The second brain itself.
Right. And there's definitely evidence suggesting it can signal the central nervous system, probably via the vagus nerve again.
Right.
Whether significant amounts directly cross the blood-brain barrier is less clear, but its local effects and this indirect signaling are likely very important.
And have they seen links between these GABA-producing bacteria and anxiety or depression?
Yes, just like with serotonin, studies have observed alterations in the populations of these GABA-producing bacteria in people dealing with depression and anxiety.
Yeah.
Lower levels sometimes.
It's just incredible to think these tiny things have such a chemical influence.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other brain chemicals they're involved with?
Oh yeah, the list goes on. Some gut microbes can produce dopamine and norepinephrine, though again, these probably act more locally in the gut or on the enteric nervous system.
Still important for gut function, though.
Absolutely. Then you have acetylcholine, made by some lactobacillus and bacillus. Acetylcholine is crucial for learning, memory, and the parasympathetic rest and digest system.
Okay.
And maybe one more to mention is histamine. Certain gut bacteria produce histamine. It's important for local immune responses, but if you get too much or you can't break it down properly, it can lead to histamine intolerance symptoms, some of which can be neurological.
Right. I've heard of histamine intolerance. So
Yeah.
these microbes are like little chemical production plants.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned those short-chain fatty acids, SEFAs, earlier with serotonin.
Yes. SCFAs, butyrate, propionate, acetate, are the main ones. They're produced when our gut bacteria ferment the dietary fiber we can't digest ourselves.
Okay, good for the gut. I know that.
Yeah.
But how do they affect the brain?
This is where it gets really interesting. SCFAs aren't just local fuel for gut cells. They have neuroactive and neuroprotective effects. And crucially, unlike gut-derived serotonin, some SCFAs can cross the blood-brain barrier.
Oh, okay. So they can get in directly.
Yes, and once they're in the brain, they can do a lot. They can influence neurotransmitter synthesis, they help modulate inflammation within the brain, they can promote the growth of new brain cells, neurogenesis, and even help keep that blood-brain barrier strong and healthy.
Wow. So eating fiber isn't just for regularity. It's literally feeding brain health through these SCFAs.
That seems to be a major pathway, yes.
Okay, so SCFAs are direct players. Now let's go back to the vagus nerve. You called it a major communication pathway.
It really is. The vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve, and it's arguably the most important physical connection in this gut-brain axis. Think of it as the main information highway running directly between the gut and the brainstem.
And you said it's bidirectional. Information goes both ways.
Exactly. Both ways. But what's really striking is that about 80%, maybe even more, of the nerve fibers in the vagus nerve are afferent.
Afferent meaning?
Meaning they carry sensory information from the gut up to the brain.
So most of the traffic is going up, telling the brain what's happening down there.
That's right. These signals travel up to the brainstem, and from there they get relayed to higher brain areas that deal with mood, stress response, appetite, places like the hypothalamus, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex.
So what kind of information is the gut constantly sending up via the vagus nerve? What's it sensing?
All sorts of things. It senses those microbial metabolites we've been talking about, like SCFAs. It can even detect components of bacterial cell walls like LPS or lipopolysaccharide.
That sounds like something the brain would want to know about.
Definitely. It also picks up on hormones released by those specialized enteroendocrine cells in the gut lining, which are often stimulated by microbial activity themselves. And, importantly, it senses inflammatory signals in the gut.
So the brain gets this constant real-time update on the gut's chemical and inflammatory status.
Pretty much. And what's cool is that signals coming from beneficial microbes, maybe via SCFAs or other molecules, can actually travel up the vagus nerve and promote anxiolytic, anxiety-reducing, and antidepressant-like effects in the brain. A healthy gut can literally send calming signals upstairs.
That's amazing. But you also mentioned it's involved in inflammation control. How does that work?
Yes, that's the other direction of traffic, the efferent signals going down from the brain. The vagus nerve is central to something called the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway.
Cholinergic involves acetylcholine.
Exactly. When the brain sends signals down the vagus nerve, it triggers the release of acetylcholine in the gut and other organs. This acetylcholine then binds to specific receptors, alpha-7 nicotinic receptors on immune cells, like macrophages.
And what does that binding do?
It tells the immune cells to chill out, basically. It inhibits their production of pro-inflammatory cytokines like TNF-alpha and IL-6. So the vagus nerve acts like a brake on inflammation in the gut.
And a healthy gut microbiome helps this braking system work better.
That's the idea. A balanced microbiota seems to promote good vagal tone. Think of vagal tone as the overall health and activity level of the vagus nerve. Higher vagal tone generally means better regulation of things like heart rate, digestion, and this anti-inflammatory reflex.
Okay, so good gut bugs mean better vagal tone, which means better inflammation control.
That seems to be the connection. But the flip side is also true. If you have dysbiosis, an imbalance, maybe an overgrowth of inflammatory bacteria, they can trigger pro-inflammatory signals in the gut.
And those signals can go up the vagus nerve too.
Yes, potentially contributing to systemic, low-grade inflammation and maybe even neuroinflammation if the signals reach the brain. It's a feedback loop.
It really shows how tightly wired it all is. It's interesting too that VNS, vagal nerve stimulation, is used for epilepsy and depression.
Exactly. And its benefits are thought to be partly due to modulating inflammation and neurotransmitter systems via these pathways.
Right. Okay, this is fascinating. Let's move on to that term you mentioned earlier, leaky gut. It sounds, well, leaky. What does it actually mean?
Leaky gut is the more common term for what scientists call increased intestinal permeability. Essentially, the lining of your intestine is normally a very strong barrier. It's just one cell layer thick, but the cells are held together really tightly by protein structures called tight junctions.
Like grout between tiles.
Kind of, yeah. Very sophisticated grout. Plus, there are other junctions, a protective mucus layer, antimicrobial peptides. It's designed to be a very selective barrier, letting nutrients in but keeping unwanted stuff out.
So leaky means that barrier is compromised. Things are getting through that shouldn't.
Precisely. The tight junctions loosen up, the barrier becomes more permeable, and things that should stay inside the gut, like fragments of bacteria, especially that LPS we mentioned, maybe undigested food proteins, microbial toxins can leak through the gut lining into the bloodstream.
Yikes. What causes the barrier to weaken like that? What makes it leaky?
A whole bunch of things, unfortunately. Dysbiosis, that imbalance in gut microbes, is a huge factor. Infections, chronic inflammation in the gut itself, like an IBD, chronic stress plays a big role.
Stress again.
Always stress. Certain medications, too, like NSAIDs, common painkillers, and dietary factors can contribute things like high-fat diets, excessive alcohol, even some food additives like emulsifiers found in processed foods.
Okay, so this unwanted stuff, LPS, bacterial bits, is now in the bloodstream. What happens next? That can't be good.
No, it's definitely not. Your immune system immediately recognizes these things as foreign invaders. LPS, for example, binds strongly to receptors called TLR4 on immune cells throughout the body.
Triggering an immune response.
Exactly. It triggers the release of pro-inflammatory cytokines. This creates a state of low-grade, chronic systemic inflammation. Sometimes it's called metabolic endotoxemia because it's driven by these endotoxins like LPS from the gut.
And this systemic inflammation, how does that reach the brain? That's the neuroinflammation link, right?
Right. There are a few ways this body-wide inflammation can stir things up in the brain. Those circulating cytokines might be able to cross the blood-brain barrier, especially if the barrier itself is a bit leaky, perhaps due to the systemic inflammation.
A vicious cycle.
It can be. Or the cytokines can signal the brain indirectly, maybe through the vagus nerve again, or through specific areas of the brain that naturally have a leakier barrier called circumventricular organs. However the signal gets there, it activates the brain's own resident immune cells,
Which are?
primarily microglia and astrocytes. Think of them as the brain's cleanup crew and support cells. but they also have immune functions.
And when they get activated by these inflammatory signals from the body,
They start releasing their own pro-inflammatory molecules right there within the brain. This can create a self-sustaining cycle of inflammation inside the brain, neuroinflammation.
and what does chronic neuroinflammation do to the brain?
It's pretty damaging over time. It can disrupt how neurons communicate, impair the birth of new neurons, neurogenesis, and the formation of connections between them, synaptic plasticity. It can mess with neurotransmitter metabolism, sometimes shunting tryptophan away from serotonin production towards making other, potentially harmful compounds. And ultimately, it can contribute to neuronal damage or death.
So this inflammation, potentially starting from a leaky gut, can really cause significant problems upstairs. And you're saying this is tied to mental health conditions.
Yes, neuroinflammation is increasingly seen as a key underlying mechanism in many neuropsychiatric conditions: depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, even neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. It really underscores why maintaining gut barrier integrity is so important.
And good gut microbes help with that barrier.
Absolutely. Beneficial bacteria, especially those SCFA producers like butyrate makers, directly nourish the cells lining the gut and help strengthen those tight junctions. They also compete with potentially harmful bacteria for space and resources, and they help modulate the local immune system in the gut to keep things calm.
It all circles back. Okay, this connection is incredibly complex. Let's shift focus a bit now to how our earliest experiences might set the stage for all this. It sounds like the first few years are critical.
They absolutely are. The period from gestation through birth and the first few years of life is a massive window of opportunity or vulnerability for the development of the gut microbiota and the entire microbiome gut-brain axis. What happens then can cast a really long shadow on mental health later on.
Let's start right at the beginning. Birth itself. How different is it for a baby's first microbes if they're born via C-section versus vaginally?
It's profoundly different. During a vaginal birth, the baby gets coated in the mother's vaginal and fecal microbes. That's like the primary seeding event. These are often rich in beneficial bacteria like lactobacillus and Prevotella.
A sort of microbial inheritance.
Exactly. But a baby born by cesarean section misses that journey through the birth canal. Their first colonizers tend to come from the hospital environment, the air, surfaces, staph, and the mother's skin. So you see more Staphylococcus, Corynebacterium, Propionibacterium initially. A very different starting team.
And what are the consequences of starting with that different team?
Well, studies consistently show that C-section babies tend to have lower initial microbial diversity. They often have delays in getting colonized by key beneficial groups like Bifidobacterium and Bacteroides, and sometimes higher levels of potentially opportunistic bugs found in hospitals.
And this difference matters long term.
It seems to. This altered early start has been linked epidemiologically to a higher risk of developing immune-related conditions later, things like asthma, allergies, and increasingly, research is suggesting links to a higher risk for neurodevelopmental issues like ADHD and autism spectrum disorder, and possibly even anxiety later in life.
Wow. What's the thinking behind why? How does that initial microbial difference translate to brain health risks?
The main theories revolve around immune system programming and gut-brain axis development. Those first microbes play a huge role in educating the infant's developing immune system. A different set of microbes might lead to different immune programming, potentially setting the stage for inflammation or immune dysfunction later. It also impacts gut barrier maturation and early signaling along the gut-brain axis.
It really highlights how crucial that initial exposure is. And research is looking at ways to mitigate this for C-section babies, right? Like vaginal seeding.
Yes, though vaginal seeding is still controversial and needs more safety and efficacy data. But there's a lot of interest in finding ways to support a healthy microbiome development in C-section infants, perhaps through specific probiotics or other strategies. It's an active area.
Okay. What about feeding in those early months? Breastfeeding versus formula, how does that shape the gut?
Breast milk is just incredible stuff. It's far more than just calories and nutrients. It's packed with bioactive components that actively cultivate a specific type of infant gut microbiome.
Like what kind of components?
Well, you've got maternal antibodies, mostly IgA, which help protect against infection. There's lactoferrin and lysozyme, which have antimicrobial properties. And then there are these amazing complex sugars called human milk oligosaccharides, or HMOs.
HMOs. I've seen those mentioned on formula cans now, too.
Yeah, some formulas are adding synthetic synthetic versions of one or two common HMOs, but breast milk contains hundreds of different types, and the mix changes over time. These HMOs are basically indigestible by the baby, but serve as specific food prebiotics for beneficial gut bacteria, especially bifidobacterium species like Bifidobacterium infantis.
So breast milk specifically feeds the good bugs.
It really does. Plus, breast milk itself contains commensal bacteria from the mother. It's a living fluid designed to establish a healthy gut ecosystem.
And how does formula feeding typically compare in terms of the resulting microbiome?
Infant formula aims to replicate the nutritional profile, of course, but historically it lacked those complex HMO structures and other bioactive components, though, as I said, some are being added now. Formula-fed infants tend to develop a gut microbiota that's often more diverse earlier on, but it's usually less dominated by those bifidobacteria. You might see higher levels of bacteroids, Clostridium, and Enterobacteriaceae sooner, making it resemble an older child's or adult's microbiota more quickly.
So different feeding leads to distinct microbial communities. Do these differences seem to have lasting effects?
Yes, the evidence suggests they do. Breastfeeding is generally associated with establishing a microbiota that supports healthy immune function and gut barrier development. These early differences in microbiota have been linked in some studies to variations in later cognitive development, stress reactivity, how kids handle stress, and the risk of developing conditions like obesity, allergies, and autoimmune diseases down the line.
And how might that link to the brain?
Those beneficial bifidobacteria that thrive on breast milk produce SCFAs, which, as we discussed, are important for brain development and function. They might also play a role in programming the HPA axis, the body's main stress response system.
It's like every early input is shaping this critical axis. Which brings us to another common early exposure, antibiotics. What happens when infants need antibiotics?
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Antibiotics can be life-saving against bacterial infections, but they are, by design, microbe killers, and they don't always discriminate perfectly between harmful and beneficial bacteria. Especially in early life when the microbiome is still developing and maybe less stable, antibiotics can be quite disruptive.
How disruptive?
They can significantly reduce microbial diversity, wipe out certain beneficial populations, allow others, sometimes less desirable, microbes to overgrow, and generally delay the maturation process of the gut microbiome. The extent of the disruption depends on the type of antibiotic, the duration of treatment, and the infant's age.
And what are the potential knock-on effects for the gut-brain axis and later mental health? Are there links?
There are growing concerns and emerging evidence. Early life antibiotic use has been pretty clearly linked to increased risks for things like inflammatory bowel disease, obesity, and allergies later on. And now studies are also starting to suggest associations with an increased risk for neurodevelopmental disorders like ASD and ADHD, and possibly even anxiety and depression later in life.
That's worrying. What are the potential mechanisms? How could antibiotics early on increase the risk of, say, anxiety years later?
Several pathways are being explored. Disrupting those early microbes might interfere with that crucial immune system education process we talked about. It could impair gut barrier maturation, leading to that leaky gut scenario. Altered microbial signals could affect vagus nerve development or function. Reduced SCFA production could impact brain development or inflammation, and it might even alter the programming of the HPA stress axis, leading to differences in stress reactivity long term.
It really emphasizes just how sensitive that early developmental window is. Okay, so we've seen how early life shapes the gut-brain axis. Now let's talk about what happens when things get out of balance later on, this state called dysbiosis, and how that relates to specific mental health conditions.
Right, so dysbiosis, just to recap, is essentially an imbalance in the gut microbial community. That could mean reduced diversity overall, a loss of beneficial microbes, an overgrowth of potentially pathogenic or pro-inflammatory ones, or just a general disruption in their function. And this state is increasingly implicated across a range of mental health disorders.
Let's start with anxiety disorders. What does the gut microbiome typically look like in people with anxiety?
Well, it's important to say research is ongoing, and findings aren't always perfectly consistent, but some common themes are emerging. Often, studies find reduced microbial diversity compared to healthy controls.
Less variety overall.
Yes, and changes in specific types of bacteria. For instance, some studies report lower levels of beneficial bugs like Faecalibacterium, Bifidobacterium, or Lactobacillus. Conversely, there might be higher levels of potentially pro-inflammatory groups like Enterobacteriaceae or certain Clostridium species. Alterations in SCFA production, particularly lower butyrate, are also frequently reported.
Okay, so the microbial landscape looks different. How might that actually contribute to feeling anxious? What are the proposed links?
It likely involves multiple pathways we've already touched on. That increased intestinal permeability, leaky gut, leading to systemic inflammation, which can then fuel neuroinflammation.
The inflammation connection again.
Definitely. Also, altered microbial production of neurotransmitters or their precursors affecting GABA levels, or serotonin availability via tryptophan. Dysregulation of the HPA axis, leading to heightened stress reactivity, and dysfunctional signaling along the vagus nerve pathway to brain regions involved in fear and anxiety processing, like the amygdala.
It sounds like multiple hits potentially originating from the gut. And animal studies back this up, you said.
They provide some compelling evidence, yes. Germ-free mice raised without any gut microbes often show exaggerated stress responses and anxiety-like behaviors compared to normal mice.
Wow.
And if you give these germ-free mice a fecal microbiota transplant, FMT, from healthy animals, you can sometimes normalize those behaviors. Even more strikingly, if you give them an FMT from anxious humans or animals, they can start to display anxiety-like behaviors themselves.
That really points a finger at the microbes, doesn't it?
It strongly suggests they play a causal role, at least in these models.
Okay. What about depression? Major depressive disorder. Are there similar microbial patterns seen there?
Yes, there's quite a bit of overlap, and the links with depression are perhaps even more studied than with anxiety currently. Reduced alpha diversity is, again, a very common finding in depression.
Lower species richness and evenness.
Exactly. And frequently, researchers observe decreases in key SCFA-producing bacteria like Faecopalabacterium prausnitzii, Coprococcus, and Roseburia. These are important butyrate producers. On the other hand, you might see increases in potentially pro-inflammatory bacteria.
So fewer good guys, maybe more inflammatory ones.
That's often the pattern. There's also evidence for alterations in tryptophan metabolism, potentially shunting it down the kynurenine pathway, which can produce neuroactive metabolites, sometimes at the expense of serotonin production.
And the mechanisms linking this gut picture to depression, similar to anxiety.
Very similar themes, yes. The leaky gut and subsequent systemic and neuroinflammation pathway is considered really central in depression research, the so-called inflammatory hypothesis of depression. Reduced SCFAs are also key. They impact BBB integrity, levels of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which is important for neuronal health, and inflammation. Altered neurotransmitter availability, serotonin, dopamine, GABA is relevant. And HPA axis hyperactivity, a classic feature of depression, can both influence and be influenced by the gut microbiota.
It sounds like a complex feedback loop. Is there any hope for interventions targeting the gut in depression?
There is. Some clinical studies using specific probiotic strains, particularly certain lactobacillus and bifidobacterium species, have shown modest benefits in reducing depressive symptoms, possibly by reducing inflammation or improving gut barrier function. Gut-healthy diets like high-fiber or Mediterranean-style diets are also being investigated and show promise. It's an exciting area.
That's really hopeful. Okay, let's touch briefly on ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder.
Yeah.
You mentioned the research here is newer.
It is, yes. It's a rapidly emerging field, but the findings are still preliminary and sometimes inconsistent compared to anxiety and depression research.
What are some of the initial hints?
Some studies have reported reduced microbial diversity in children or adults with ADHD, but not all. There have been reports of alterations in specific bacterial taxa, maybe lower Faecalibacterium or Bifidobacterium in some, potential increases in others, but again, it's not a clear, consistent signature across studies yet.
So less clear-cut than depression, say.
Yeah, right. One interesting finding came from a study looking at infants who received probiotics early on. It suggested that higher bifidobacterium levels in infancy were associated with a lower likelihood of developing ADHD later in childhood. That's intriguing, but needs replication. There's also theoretical interest in altered SCFA production, potentially affecting brain development, and possible links to neurotransmitter pathways, especially dopamine, which is central to ADHD.
And the potential mechanisms linking gut to ADHD symptoms. What are people proposing?
Similar ideas again. Neuroinflammation possibly affecting brain development, particularly in dopaminergic pathways. Maybe impaired absorption of certain micronutrients essential for brain function. Leaky gut could be a factor. And of course, those early life influences, delivery mode, diet, antibiotics, are also being considered as potential contributors to both gut dysbiosis and ADHD risk.
And is there interest in dietary or probiotic approaches for ADHD too?
There certainly is. Things like elimination diets, omega-3 fatty acid supplementation, and probiotics are all being looked at for managing ADHD symptoms. Some preliminary findings are positive. but much more rigorous research is needed before we can make strong recommendations.
It really sounds like the gut-brain connection in ADHD is a space to watch.
Yeah.
And it highlights that this is probably a two-way street for all these conditions, right? Gut affects brain, but brain and behavior likely affect gut too.
Absolutely. It's rarely just one direction. Chronic stress associated with mental health conditions can directly impact gut motility, secretions, and permeability. Dietary patterns might change. Medication use can affect the microbiome. It's definitely a complex interplay.
Which brings us nicely back to this core idea you wanted to anchor us with, microbial resilience. Our gut microbes aren't necessarily fragile flowers, are they? They can bounce back.
That's a great point. The gut microbiota is actually remarkably dynamic and generally resilient. It can often recover quite well from short-term disturbances, maybe a course of antibiotics, a bout of traveler's diarrhea, a few days of poor eating.
But not always.
Not always. Chronic or very severe disruptions, especially if they happen during those critical early life windows we discussed, can sometimes overwhelm that resilience. This might lead to a loss of key beneficial species or functions, resulting in a more persistent state of dysbiosis that's harder to bounce back from.
And you've really stressed that everyone's gut microbiome is unique, like a fingerprint.
Exactly. It's shaped by our genetics, our long-term diet, lifestyle, environment, medication history, all our life experiences. This inherent individuality is why responses to interventions, whether it's a specific diet change, a probiotic, or anything else aimed at the microbiome, can vary so widely from person to person.
So what works wonders for one person might do very little for someone else.
Precisely, which is why this whole deep dive has really been focused on understanding the mechanisms, how the gut and brain talk, how microbes produce neurotransmitters, signal via the vagus nerve, influence inflammation, maintain the barrier. It's about understanding the principles.
Rather than offering a universal gut health prescription.
Right. We wanted to highlight how a diverse, balanced microbial community supports health, the factors that disrupt it, and how nurturing gut health supporting barrier function, managing inflammation, contributes to mental wellness. But feeding your microbiome isn't one size fits all. For many, focusing on diverse fiber sources is great. For someone with SIBO or histamine intolerance, a more targeted approach might be needed initially. Context matters hugely.
So the real goal here is empowerment through knowledge, right? Helping you, the listener, understand this vital connection, consider your own gut health as part of your mental wellness picture, but always respecting that individual variability.
Absolutely. That's the core message.
Well, this has been just fascinating, a truly eye-opening look at the microbiome gut-brain axis. It genuinely shifts the paradigm for thinking about mental health.
It really does. I think the takeaway is that our gut microbes aren't just passive bystanders. They are active participants. They're influencing our neurotransmitters, our immune system, our stress response, inflammation levels, all things critically important for brain function and mental state.
And we've seen how imbalances, dysbiosis, and that leaky gut phenomenon are being increasingly tied to conditions like anxiety, depression, and potentially others.
And crucially, how those very early stages of life lay such a vital foundation for the long-term health and function of this entire axis.
But the final note really seems to be about fostering resilience within our own unique microbial world, understanding our individual landscape, rather than chasing simple, universal dietary fixes.
Exactly. It's about personalization and understanding the fundamentals.
So for you listening, as you digest all this information, maybe literally, perhaps take a moment, reflect on your own gut health. Could it be connected to how you feel mentally? Think about your early life, maybe recent dietary changes, stress levels. How might those pieces fit together in your unique picture? We're not suggesting diagnoses or treatments, of course, but just encouraging that curiosity. Understanding your own gut-brain connection could be a really valuable part of your personal wellness journey.